Good morning. I want to talk to you about the First Council of Nicea. The first thing you have to understand about the Council of Nicea is that it was a consensus. It was a consensus among arguing factions. And so the difference between a government committee and a truth seeker or a philosopher is seeking the truth, where a government committee is seeking to form a policy that functions, so that you have a functioning government, right? And of course, the government and the church were one back then. It was part of the government was the church at the time. But the important point you have to understand is that what they did at the Council of Nicea was that they formed a consensus among arguing factions. So in this consensus among arguing factions, they said, this is what Christianity is. This is the doctrine of Christianity. We have reached a consensus among arguing groups. Now, I'd like to point out, before we go any further, that this took place in a Christian, European Christian, Greek Christian territory, which is now controlled by Muslim Turks. So they lost that territory. And I think that speaks quite interestingly. Well, it speaks on the value of their policy. And did it work? Did the policy work? Was the policy rooted in the truth? Right? Now, a philosopher is not a government committee. A philosopher is someone seeking the truth, right? Someone that loves the truth, someone that's seeking the truth. And they don't always have all the information. So philosophers don't always get it right. But they're seeking the truth. The Council of Nicea was a committee of philosophers who were trying to understand the story of Christ. And they were all arguing about it because they didn't have all the information and they got confused by the story. And that is at the root of the Council of Nicea is a big confusion that people were arguing about. And it wasn't necessarily about finding out what the truth was and who's right and who's wrong. It was about forming a consensus for a policy of the government, the religious government. And they said, this is what Christianity is. So a little bit about the factions that were arguing with one another. There were many, but the two main factions, or the three main factions, were a group called the Homosians and the Homoiasians, and then the Arion Heresy, which we'll also talk about. So now these two groups, the Homosians, let's see if we can pronounce it, the Homoiasians, the Homoiasians, okay, that means, homo means same, and homoi means similar, okay? Now, what are they talking about? That the Son of God, Jesus Christ, was the same as God, or, those are the Homosians. The Homoiasians said the Son of God was similar to the Father. This was the big argument. Is the Son of God the same as the Father, or is the Son of God similar to the Father, right? Now, why would they be arguing this point? They're arguing this point because it's confusing, right? It's confusing. The Son of God, how can God have a son? Now, what is the root of this confusion? The root of this confusion is they don't realize they're reading an allegory. They don't realize they're reading an allegory. So then they're trying to understand, well, how does God become a man? And is it the same? And what does all this mean? And so they're arguing about it. Well, the first thing you have to know when you're reading the story of Jesus, the life of Jesus, is that it's an allegory. If you don't know that, then none of it's going to make sense and you're going to be totally confused. Now, so then the third area there is the Arion heresy. So what did the Arians say? Right? They're watching these Homosians and the Homoiasians arguing about, is Jesus the same as the Father, or is he similar in nature to the Father? And they're saying, well, obviously this is a legend about a real guy, right? Because here's the third misconception. The third misconception was the Arian heresy, who said, well, these guys are arguing about the story of Jesus. Obviously, this is a man. And so they must have mythologized his life. So what the Arians did, which was completely false, is they said, well, he's just a man. He's just a prophet. You see? This is what led to Islam and the Arab prophet Jesus that frankly never existed. And so here we have the Arian heresy, which says that Jesus is a man. He wasn't the Son of God. That's just a mythology about him. He was just preaching, his religion, and he was a revolutionary. That is false. You have to understand this. And I'm telling you this because I fell into that trap when I first started reading the story of the Bible. Because I'm like, what do these Christians start making sense? And this whole story doesn't make sense the way they're saying it. So I read the story. I said, well, obviously Jesus is just a prophet. I mean, obviously he's just a man. And then they mythologize him. No. I was wrong. Jesus was not a man. And that's the real question that you have to ask yourself. Is Jesus an allegorical figure, or was he a real man? Because what the Arians and the Homoousians and the Homosians all said was that he was a man and he was God, that he was divine and God and man. Now the truth is, Jesus was never a man. Jesus was never born. That's a big story. It's a beautiful story, but it's a story which is an allegory. So now this is why. So let me explain something to you. All of Christianity is based on the Nicene Creed, which was a policy of the church which came out of an argument. So it's not about finding the truth, it's about establishing a policy to end the arguing. So it's not about seeking the truth, it's about establishing a consensus among arguing factions so that everybody will be in agreement on the same page, so there will be universality throughout the church, so everyone believes the same thing. Now, does it matter if that same thing is false? No, not exactly. They just needed everyone to stop arguing, so they came up with a consensus. Now, when you study the story of the life of Jesus, it's quite obviously an allegory. Even if you thought his life, even if you think he's a real person, the whole story of his life is an allegory. That's why he's killed at the skull. That's why That's why the Jews choose between Barabbas, which means the word of the rabbis. Barabbas. Rabbas actually comes from Rabban. And in Greek, they put S's on the end of things. It's rabbis, rabbis. It doesn't mean son of the Father. I covered that in another video. Barabbas is the rabbis. Jesus is the Word of God. So you have the Word of God versus the rabbis. Do you want the Word of God or do you want the rabbis? Why was that story told? Because the Jews, the rabbis, had developed their own doctrine. That's what Jesus says throughout the story, is that they're teaching the doctrines of men, which is their own doctrine. They love their own doctrine more than the Word of God. And Jesus symbolizes the Word of God. That's the whole story. The whole story is that they had their own doctrine. Today we call that doctrine the Talmud. Okay, it's not the Word of God. The Talmud is not the Word of God. The rabbis don't claim that the Talmud is the Word of God. It's the word of the rabbis. It's their interpretation of the Bible. It's their interpretation. It's their traditions. Washing your hands before you eat was one of the things that came up in the Bible. Now, that's a good thing. Wash your hands before you eat. But that's a tradition of the rabbis, right? And they had a lot of different traditions. They were the traditions of the rabbis, not the Word of God. That is the primary argument, which is why the Bible, or the story of Jesus, was written. The story of Jesus was written about that argument between the Word of God and the rabbis, okay? So Jesus symbolizes the Word of God. So let me explain another thing. In John 1, it says Jesus is the Word of God, and the Word of God was with God. And then it goes on to explain that, and Jesus is the light, and that light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Okay? The darkness comprehended it not. Now, this is a metaphor of Genesis 1:3, right? God said in Genesis 1:3, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the light separated the day from the night. Well, in John 1, Jesus is the light, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. See how this is actually philosophy? And so when you start saying, well, then, like I just heard this preacher grabbing a coffee and walking my dog, and I was coming home, and I had the AM radio on. This preacher's going on about manna and how many tons of manna there were, and how it was a supernatural thing, and it really happened. And it's like, no, that's a story, okay? And that's a story, and when they get into the metric tons of manna and how many days they were out there and stuff. Well, some of that stuff, some of the timing and the days, actually that does matter because that relates to the calendar. But I don't want to get into that story too much. I'm just trying to give you an example. Is that they get into the specifics of the story and they start arguing about the specifics. It says, well, Jesus was the Son of the Father, and how did that happen? And they try to get into the mathematics and the physics of it, and none of that matters because it's an allegory. And now you're trying to understand an allegory literally, and it's not going to make sense. That's the key point. If you try to understand an allegory in literal terms, it doesn't make sense because it's an allegory and you're reading it wrong. So the first council of Nicea was about a bunch of people reading the book wrong and arguing about it because it didn't make sense, and they were trying to explain it, and they had strong opinions, and they said, well, it has to be this way and it has to be that way. And the Arians said, you're both of you guys are wrong. Jesus wasn't God. He was just a man like everybody else. All three of those groups were wrong, because the truth is that the story of Jesus is an allegory. It's an allegory. When you read it as an allegory, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense as an allegory. Now, so what happened? You had Christianity form. Okay. Now, Christianity, as we know it and is still as practiced, is based on the Council of Nicea. So it's not based on what the truth is of the story or is it an allegory. It's the policy they set. That policy that was established in the Council of Nicea in 325 and on is the policy ever since, and it's just been, that's the policy. There is no other Christianity. It's this. And it hasn't been correct. It wasn't correct because in order to be a Christian, let's say, you have to believe that Jesus was the Son of God and that he was killed on the cross and that he was born of a virgin and that that's all real and that really happened. And so now you've agreed to take the book literally. And if you do, you're not going to understand the story as it was written originally, which is an allegory. Do you see? In fact, the whole initiation into Christianity means you will never understand the allegory, and you're initiating yourself into a fixed idea, which will prevent you from understanding the story. Because you walk into church and they say, we believe this, and that. That's what you have to believe in order to be a Christian. You go, I want to be a Christian, so I believe that. And now when you go to read the story, none of it's going to make sense. And that's why we have this this new religion that came after, which was called Islam, based on the Arion heresy, which was a heresy. Now, I originally, like I said, bought into the Arian heresy of Jesus was just a man, he was just a prophet just like everybody else, and they mythologized his life and da-da-da, because I didn't know it was an allegory. I thought these Christians that came out of the Nicea, they obviously were wrong, so the Arian heresy was more likely right, because that's obviously the true one, because these other things don't make any sense. No, they were all three of them wrong. The Arian heresy was wrong because Jesus was not a man. There was no man Jesus. It's an allegory. Jesus is. Let me tell you, so let me define Jesus for you. Jesus is the Word of the God of Israel. Jesus is the light of God, which is a metaphorically shown as the sun, the light of. So when God creates the world in Genesis, and He says, "Let there be light," He's talking about a physical light. But in Christianity, in John 1, let there be light is a metaphor for the light of wisdom, the light of truth. The light of God is the light of wisdom and truth. You see? And that's the King of Judah. You see? The Word of God, the light of God, wisdom and truth. That's the King of Judah. And that's what's put to death at the skull at Golgotha. Right? The Word of God, the light of God. What happens when Jesus is on the cross and he's put to death? The lights go out. It becomes dark. Right? It's a metaphor. The story is an allegory. You have to know what those terms mean. Okay, so you can argue with Muslims all day. The Muslims are so fixed in the Arian heresy that they're literally, I haven't found one that understands what an allegory is, because they say, how can man become God? How can man be born of woman? That makes no sense. And you go, well, it's an allegory. But it says here that she was born. That means he was a man. And I'd say, but it's an allegory. But see, it says, and see, they can't process it. Now, the danger for them in processing that idea and realizing, oh, it's an allegory, well, that would mean that their entire religion of Islam is false. So they can't do that. And the Christians not as much. You could convince a Christian it's an allegory. It'll hurt them a bit, especially if they're part of a church, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or some other church that they've really bought into the idea that this is a literal thing, which most Christians have. So they're going to have a little more trouble with it. But see, the difference is a Christian can see the story of Jesus as a real man and still see the allegory in the story because they know the story well enough to see, oh, I see how there's a hidden meaning there. But what they don't realize is that's why the story was written. So now here's another point. Is that the pre-count... Okay. Oh, I know what it is. So, well, let me put it this way. Philo-Judaeus was an early writer of Greek philosophy and the Bible because he was a Jewish Greek philosopher. And he explains that the Bible, that his works and his writings were meant to harmonize Greek philosophy with the teachings in the Bible. And a lot of the stuff that you see in Christian philosophy comes from the Greek philosophy of Philo-Judaeus. It also comes from the Egyptian philosophy. It comes from the ancient Israelite philosophy. It comes out of some of the stuff from the Akkadian religion. But that's another story. The point of the story is that, oh, I know what I was going to say, is that these are allegories, and it's meant to be an allegory. And what's it rooted in? This is the key point. It's rooted in the heavens. And this is why you could say that the Bible really is the quote-unquote Word of God, in that it comes from the stars. Because the authors of these books, they created a theme for the Bible which was based on the stars. And they were stargazers. And so that's the last point I'll try to make, is that the light of God is a metaphor for God's truth, but it's also the light of God, the physical light. And so the Word of God is the story in the heavens that goes over the sky in the day and the night. And so you always have an original copy, is what I'm trying to say. You always have an original copy of the Bible. And all these people that say, we found this copy, and we found that copy, and you have a corrupted version. Well, the real version's up there, and you can go outside day or night and look at it and watch it. And the stars passing over the earth is the original gospel, is the original Bible. That is the original Bible, which all the books of the Bible are written on and based on. And all the Egyptian books and all the Chaldean books, they're all based on the heavens. So that's the last point I want to make. I hope that helps. But the Nicene Council is basically you have to understand it's a consensus among arguing factions. Those arguing factions had it wrong because they didn't realize it was an allegory. When you realize that Jesus Christ is the light of God, which is the Word of God, which is the King of Judah, put to death at the skull by the rabbis, Barabbas versus the Word of God, you understand the story and it all makes sense. And then, of course, it takes Jesus 40 days to get to heaven, because that's called the Easter tide, right? 40 days for the sun, because the sun is a symbol of the light of God, right? It's both metaphorical as a object and also as the truth. So it takes Jesus 40 days to get to heaven, the ascension, right? So you start out in the Passover, 40 days later, you're in the beginning of summer. Same thing happens with Noah's Ark. It takes 40 days once the rain falls for Noah's Ark to lift up off the ground and rise up and start to move across the up over the mountains. And that goes on for 150 days, which is throughout the whole summer, and then it stops after 150 days and it lands on Mount Ararat in the 7th month, which is September, which is the month of the autumn equinox. So you go from spring through summer to autumn. That's the story of Noah's Ark. There's a lot of other themes in the Bible. Now, I'll say this also. God in the Bible is also sometimes portrayed as a storm god, just like Baal was. But it's not Baal. It's like Baal, because those old stories were translated into new stories with a new God, but they used some of these old themes. But it was generally always things that are taking place in the heavens. So I'll end off with that. And thanks for watching my videos, and I hope that helps.